Oh, Cotton, hey man, welcome back to the Elders Recess. I've really missed you.
Oh boy, it's you.
It's been so long, how are you doing?
I'm alright, I guess.
You're the first person I've talked to in 3 weeks. This is wonderful.
That's because nobody likes you.
What?
I mean, that's because everyone's busy with Iceborne, and
I come here all the way from the old world after coming all the way from Frontier in the first place.
Yes, that classic geographical location.
And all I get is hate. You know what? That's it. I'm leaving.
Yay!
But I'll be back, and in greater numbers too. Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, in a lot of ways, we live in simply the best time to be a Monster Hunter player. Between Iceborne and its seemingly never-ending supply of fantastic DLC monsters from old to new, it's like every monster you walk up to is like opening a present, even when they are monsters returning from the old games with their new movesets and visuals, and for a lot of us, there is just nothing better. However, times are not quite so bright for anyone who loves Monster Hunter Frontier, as the game is shutting down its servers in December of 2019 for good. Now, it's no secret that on this channel we simply admire Frontier from afar, so to say, but today I'll be bringing it just a touch closer.
Grease me up, woman!
Okie dokie.
So with this considered, in combination with the pure quality dripping off of every returning monster in Iceborne, I think it is about time to start arranging a Noah's Ark type deal for Frontier. So ladies and gentlemen, today I'll be talking about my top 5 Frontier monsters to come to Iceborne. One important disclaimer, this is not the top 5 Frontier monsters in general, it's the top 5 monsters that I would like to see translated into Iceborne, meaning there are a lot more factors than just how simply cool a monster is. So without further ado, my hauntingly happy hunters, let us begin with
Honourable Mentions. Ray and Lolo Gugarth.
These guys were actually really difficult for me because I absolutely love them, but it is sort of extremely hard to argue for the whole magnetic theme to work in the realism of the new world. I mean, maybe it could happen, but if it were to happen, it would need to be brought in by a much more serious monster, only to have these guys show up a little bit later, but they definitely wouldn't be the bringers of Magnet to the main series, which is a real shame. Visually speaking, my preference of these two is of course Lolo, the bright reddish bulldog-shaped monster. Like if I were to take one thing out of Frontier on a purely visual level, it might just be this one. I fucking love how he looks, but don't get me wrong, because Ray is pretty neat too. I really do love the concept of having two large monsters that are always fought as one fight. I think tag team fights and group fights in general are super unique and fun mechanics, and these guys just represent that idea perfectly. I mean, the magnetism affects a massive part of their moveset and makes them legitimately work together throughout the fight just sort of passively, and of course visually they represent the north and south pole of a magnet as well, so they absolutely are just their own tight little package.
You are tight like a tiger.
Their moveset in general is a little extravagant, but we also have Zinogre, who is flippy as all hell in Iceborne anyway, so really the only thing keeping me from wanting them at the end of the day is the whole magnetism thing as a concept. I think it would really struggle to exist in general in the new world with its realism, and again, if it did come, if it came, it would have to come in a much more serious monster package to begin with, so at least for the time being, I just don't see this one happening, unfortunately.
Number 5.
Oh, gooberfish! Big gooberfish!
There's always a bigger fish.
Paria Perea.
And with a name like that, whether you've seen this creature or not, it isn't all that hard to work out how you'd probably feel about it at the end of the day. The simple description of this outlandish monster is a flying wyvern that is also a fish, and anyone who has fought any of the Piscine wyverns has probably already tried to leave the room.
Get me the hell out of here!
But I really think everyone should give this guy a chance. I mean, I strongly believe a lot of the taste for Piscine wyverns as a whole is their body shape. As for the majority of their fights, they are standing on their big chunky legs, and for most of them that just puts the majority of their body out of the reach for the whole time, so you're more or just less stabbing at a pair of feet. As a result, you wind up with your camera 1 foot from the monster inside of its legs, and it's just significantly hard to see attack animations, so why not try a fish as an idea, as a concept, but in an entirely different body shape? Well, Paria Perea will accomplish that for you, but with a few extra mechanics on top of it. So visually, at least in Frontier, there isn't a huge amount to talk about. It's a pseudo-wyvern with a fish head and a fishy tail, though I do think in the New World, the graphics of this creature would make him look exponentially better, as fish scales are just one of those things that require proper detail. Moving on to the actual mechanics of the fight then, this monster is a chronic eater. It will just eat whatever the hell it can. Like, a proper mechanic of this hunt is that his drool will change color based on what he is hungry for, which is an actual thing that hunters can take advantage of because it correlates to all of these sleep and paralysis and poison meats that we can lay on the floor, which initiates a special interaction, and if you put the wrong one down, he legitimately gets angry at you, and as a whole, I find that hilarious. He will also just eat dirt out of the floor, and his final main mechanic is that he will just fire the contents of his stomach at you, which with just dirt gives you the soil ailment. However, after using special meats, can leave you poisoned, paralyzed, or even asleep. And then on top of this, he has the classic normal fish element of water, which is always welcome to see. All in all, I think a lot of this creature is super interesting, and while in its current state it's absolutely an oddity, I think if brought into Iceborne with Iceborne's mechanics and given a proper rework like all the returning monsters have gotten, he could simply be the best fish-based wyvern in the game.
Number 4. Toreador.
I've always had a bit of a sweet spot for the lower tier monsters in the games. I mean, aside from the basic little raptor boys, they've all been so chock full of unique, fun personality. I mean, Dodogama, who we all know and love, but even something like Royal Ludroth. I fucking love Royal Ludroth as a concept. And unfortunately, the upper tier of monsters is usually reserved for things that are cool and mysterious and not spongy leviathans. Sure, there are very, very rare exceptions, but for the most part, the more difficult a monster is, the less derpy and fun it is intended to look. And while I think Bocarodon isn't necessarily intended to look funny per se, I mean, he's a giant fucking seal, and for the most part, that is his design.
Well, duh.
Sure, he is shaped a bit more like a leviathan and given some spikiness, but he is a seal, and seals are fucking awesome, and this is just one of the best looking seals that I've seen in a long time. Not to mention how well I can imagine him visually fitting into Iceborne. I mean, he just sort of looks right to me in the world. Moveset wise, he has a lot of just sort of basic leviathan-esque attacks that aren't all that special. However, he does fling snowballs, and he also slides around, which is hilarious, and on rare occasions, he will literally stop fighting to clap and then pounce on a hunter, which is fucking wonderful. Like, I just have to picture a bunch of developers sitting in a boardroom like, okay, new monster, we have a whole world of opportunities. What do you got? All right, how about a half seal, half walrus that claps before it tries to hug you? And that is basically how low tier monster design is done just as a whole. I love it, I truly do. And I think this is one of the monsters that could make it to the new world with minimal changes. Like, in theory, you could put this monster in just as it already is, and it would function fine and be great. But the reason this guy shows up here ahead of some of the other monsters that aren't even on the list is simply because I think that the world rework treatment for him would do such a ridiculous amount of good.
Number 3. Boru.
Okay, full disclosure, my favorite medieval weapon is a flail. In a lot of situations, this might be a random statement, but here, it actually makes sense. As Boru here has a tongue that essentially functions as a blood-sucking flail. And I mean, just from the get-go, that drags me in like nothing else. I think as a general design, he is relatively cool, the classic long leviathan shape, but looking much more like a prehistoric land creature than an underwater creature forced out of the sea. And as such, he looks a little bit terrifying, but like in a good way. Fight-wise, this monster is a little bit unusual. He has some basic Leviathan moves, as well as a Diablos-esque burrow attack, and tons of flicky tongue attacks, but right out of the gate, he isn't really limited elementally, which is just an absolutely massive thing for a monster, as he starts off as a water monster, but due to the nature of his tongue, he's able to actually switch elements. Once in a while, he will grab something, either a player or a small monster, and, well, suck out whatever liquids it can.
I drink your milkshake. I drink it up!
Which is not only an effective combat maneuver, but also changes how he acts. By default, he is a water monster with water attacks, and I do love water monsters, so that is a plus. But if he does this attack on, let's say, an Paria Perea, his neck expands as his storage sac fills up with poison and gives him a nice purple line to make you aware of this. If he does the same thing to a Genprey, he gains a yellow line and paralysis attacks. And if he does it to a hunter, which he can, he gains access to blood attacks, which exists solely to lower your your weapon's sharpness, which is a neat little unique mechanic. Visually speaking, I'm sort of against how this looks. Like, just pure aesthetics, I don't think it looks great with a purple line down the side of his very much not purple body. However, I 100% do appreciate the developers giving us a strong visual representation of this mechanic, so I am more than willing to put up with a little bit of color mismatch. What really makes me want this guy in the new world, however, is the idea that his element and status absorption isn't really limited to these options. So as much as it was limited by the habitat that he lives in now, he could technically extract anything given a new environment, and maybe even from large monsters, which would be a real neat thing to see active in the new world. And a solid rework to his basic core abilities would round him out to be a fantastic Iceborne fight, in my personal opinion.
Number 2.
An active brain and eyes on a speedy swordfish is a deadly advantage while hunting fish and squid in colder waters.
Uppity Sue.
And this one, I'm completely willing to admit, is more or less an entirely visual thing. A fucking swordfish flying wyvern, or I guess a carpenter shark if you want to be a bit more technically accurate, but it looks badass, and that's the point. Also, the sword is the point.
It's science.
And even aside from the head, I love the just general look and color scheme of the monster. I mean, honestly, if somehow the situation came up where Capcom decided to recycle the look of this monster, give it an entirely different identity, an entirely different fight, just to get the visual look into the game, I think I'd still be okay with it at least, but really it would be extremely unnecessary, as Uppity Sue has a pretty damn awesome fight. Sure, he has a few chargy elements and a few diggy elements that can make him seem a bit like just a Diablos on ice. But I promise you, he is so much more than that. He has icy backflips, sort of reminiscent of Rathian with a touch of Velkhana, general icy breaths, and when he does dig, his actual animation is, well, significantly more shark-like and often makes tiny geysers. He also has a couple of bigger moves where he totally tears up the ground and makes giant geysers, but I remain a little bit unconvinced that this attack would translate to the new world at all, as it's about as visually extravagant as the super moves of Elder Dragons. He also has a bit of the falling ice crystal action going on that Velkhana has, which wasn't even a comparison before Iceborne, but hey, the mechanic is now in the main series, so we have that going for us. Probably the most interesting remaining thing is when he gets properly injured, and Uppity Sue reveals his hidden dragon element, which then affects all of his physical attacks, making him much faster and stronger, but then his ice attacks and his geysers become massive and enhanced, and the final little phase of this fight is an absolutely crazy experience, even to just watch, not even to experience as a fight. And this is where I really think this monster would need some work if brought into the new world, but at the same time, that is an expected change. A moveset rework to this monster would be almost required, and I could absolutely see it being possible to alter the moveset to be less flashy without removing what really makes this monster have the personality that he has. But the reason that a monster that I love this much isn't number one is because I think he'd just need to be changed a lot to fit in the game, and his fight would probably wind up being nothing like it is in Frontier. So as much as I do love him in his current incarnation, and I think visually he would translate fantastically into the new world, due to my expectations for him, he is stuck at number 2 on this list, rather than being
Number 1.
Don't spit in his mouth. No, don't spit it back! Don't swallow it.
Ruru.
Put simply, I think this monster is one of the most visually intriguing monsters in the entire series, especially in the rare spot of being a high-powered bird wyvern, though he does act significantly more like a flying wyvern that is just called a bird wyvern because of how he looks.
What do you mean, you people?
What do you mean, you people?
Honestly, I've always wanted a flying wyvern shape that was just a proper giant-ass bird, and Ruru nails that visually in so many ways. Fight-wise, in Frontier, he can smack his elongated beak at the ground a lot like Yangaruga and Yankaku in the older games, but for the most part, he has a lot of the physical moveset of Rathalos, for example. However, this fight gets interesting when he starts to eat. And yes, I know this is the third time a mechanic like this has been on the list, but A, it is used a fair bit in Frontier, and B, I really like this mechanic, so fuck off. This monster can choose to use its elongated and shapely beak to suck the nectar out of the various flowers of its environment, which changes its attacks to have various ailments, which actually changes the entire color scheme of the monster, which just makes the fight absolutely stunning to watch, but also it adds a ton of variety to the fight itself, and is exactly the type of mechanic that carries a ton of potential for the new world. Sure, we have Pookie as a plant-eating bird wyvern, but its plant-eating nature is severely fairly limited, so I don't really see this monster overstepping any sort of boundaries. Visually speaking, I think this could simply be one of the best looking fights in the entire game if done right. It is incredibly unique in a proper fully feathered monster in this shape, and I just see so much potential for the varied states and the way the developers could rework the fight to make each of these various states a totally unique and different experience from one another. Just some neat unique attacks that don't apply to the other statuses, and bam, drops a good one. Long story short, I just see an absolutely massive visual and mechanical potential for this monster, and I think a modern take on him in the modern environment of the new world would be the perfect place to reach said potential, therefore making this monster my straight up number 1 on this list. Alright everyone, I've been Cotton Dinosaur, and this has been my list of the top 5 frontier monsters to come to Iceborne. Do you agree with my list? What other monsters would you like to see brought over from Frontier to the New World? Like if you like the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. This is the brand new outro to tell you all the things that you do that we love, so let's start with something simple and say, oh, we love your eyes. When they're watching us play video games, when we make a bunch of jokes that are kinda lame, or when they gaze upon our failures as we try to kill the monsters or important news about the kingdom Animalia. Rage, Cotton, and Hollow are all here, talking about the things you want to hear, so if you want to be the first to hear, like and subscribe and the bell and we'll cheer. Some of you are patrons even though we are all the noobs and you're the pros. There's nothing we can do to thank you. No, really, there's nothing we could possibly do. Goodbye.